Hello, and welcome to this interview, which is one of a series discussing some of the topics that will be addressed at the World Nuclear Association Strategic eForum on Sustainable Finance, taking place on March 18th. Today, I am joined by Adam Rodman, founder and chief investment officer of Segra Capital Management. Adam, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Let's just jump straight into it, shall we? What would you say to policymakers evaluating plans about revitalizing the economy following the pandemic, whilst also ensuring that we deliver sustainable decarbonization?
Well, I'm definitely going to show my bias, which hopefully is a good thing here given the audience. But it's no surprise that nuclear projects, being that they are infrastructure and personnel intensive, are a great way not only to provide critical infrastructure in the wake of a pandemic, frankly, anytime, but they also serve as long-standing, high-quality job banks into the future. So, unlike maybe comparable infrastructure projects or infrastructure projects vying for the same stimulus-related funds, I think nuclear projects provide an excellent source of not only short but long-term employment and infrastructure benefits to any economy in which they're being approved.
So there has been a lot of discussion over the last about a year about the EU taxonomy. So what are your views on the taxonomy and on the broader discussion around ESG and ESG criteria for the financing of low carbon technologies?
Well, again, showing my bias, I don't think nuclear gets a very fair shake when it comes to this. And I dare say that policymakers and decision makers are kind of violating their own rubric and their own rules if and when they exclude nuclear. If first and foremost, our goal is decarbonization, seems very foolhardy, at least to me, to avoid the only baseload generating source that is actually emissions free. And going even further to that on that point into ESG metrics, not only the environmental side, so the carbon side, but also the social and governance, the nuclear industry, and I mean both generation in terms of nuclear power plants, but really all the way through even to their supply chains, are generally industry leading in terms of social and governance issues as well. Safety, diversity, again, from an employment perspective and longevity of longevity of employees and treating them equally, very strong track record relative to other industries. And so maybe that's a follow-up question, but nuclear ends up mostly being maligned as far as we can tell as investors because of waste issues. And even that's not very well understood by the market, and it isn't really given a fair platform for which the relative benefits of a small waste footprint can be argued. So I would again say not very equal and not very fair, but nuclear should absolutely be in the green taxonomy.
So from your perspective, how can we then deliver this sort of level playing field, which clearly isn't available at the moment?
Well, that's a multi-billion-dollar question, I suppose. If I were speaking to policymakers, I would ask them really, truly, what their ultimate end goal is. Again, arguing from my own bias, but I think if you look back over the last 5 or 10 years, really we've had more of a soft commitment to carbon reduction. It's been great in principle, but I don't think anyone would argue against the fact that the seriousness with which the world is addressing climate change has accelerated over the last 18 months. And in many cases, given the legally binding consequences of meeting carbon emissions targets, let's just say the stakes have been escalated. And so if the true goal is carbon reduction, then I think that the discussion around nuclear's role therein also becomes more serious, because the idea that we can rely on renewables and then a multi-decade development of battery storage as our solution has much less credibility, for targets that we are going to start measuring in a much more serious way, today. So just policymakers, let's not continue fooling ourselves. If we actually want to meet our reduction goals, we can't be reducing nuclear generation in favor for renewables. We've seen that experiment in many places around the world, and the empirical data isn't good. If we're talking to the potential financial backers of various nuclear plants, again, nuclear timelines and nuclear costs have not been very fairly portrayed. But if we get to the point where we have support for nuclear and in a more broad-based sense, and we can move into what kind of the Segra team calls fleet mode of nuclear reactor development, where it's scaled, single design, and most importantly, gets financial terms akin to other clean green energy sources, the economic picture is going to change very favorably as well. So, financial firms who are financing these projects, don't let the last several years of unequal playing field skew your opinions. Just look at in your neck of the woods, the Hinkley Point reactor set, and just see what a large component of the life of operation costs come in the form of interest. And if that interest cost was lower, just how much more competitive it would be.
Yeah. And obviously key to a lot of this is the question of confidence and the question of investor confidence. So what can the nuclear sector do to increase the confidence that investors should have in the nuclear industry?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I think you're opening yourself up to a little bit of criticism here, if I may. The nuclear industry at large has not done a good job, in my opinion, a relatively good job, at marketing against their competing generation sources. And the nuclear sector should focus on the facts, the empirical data, and not be afraid to talk very loudly about what the actual safety record and the actual generating efficiency of the industry is versus their peers. And I think a long legacy, malignment of the industry has caused many, even in strong, powerful ranks of nuclear industry, of nuclear industry groups, to kind of beat around the bush or be shy about it, because the pushback has generally been hyperbolic and difficult to dispute, which is that as a boogeyman, whether it's the very few accidents that we've had at nuclear power facilities, at nuclear power plants in the 60 or 70-year operating history of the industry, or the very kind of easy hyperbolic view that radioactive waste is something that can't be addressed, the industry seems to clam up on those issues. And at least from my perspective, not only as an investor, but as a proponent of nuclear energy, I think the industry should be taking those criticisms and throwing it right back in the face of their detractors, because those are actually, in my opinion, the biggest strong points for the technology. I mean, nothing is without risk, but all of the risks need to be put in context, and the industry has not done a good job of doing that.
I mean, that is very, very interesting. And speaking of perspective and context, we often talk about decarbonization and we often think about the developed world. But we also clearly need to keep in mind that in order for decarbonization to be proper, it needs to be equitable. And that leads us to the final question, which is around the developing world. So how significant do you think that the role of, for instance, multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank, how significant can their roles be in delivering sort of the cost-effective, low-carbon and reliable energy sources that doubtlessly will be required in all parts of the world?
While not an expert on development banks necessarily, I will 100% support how critical any source of capital is particularly in the emerging world. We think in the West, in the developed world, how difficult from a central planning perspective it is to get various projects approved. Obviously, add multiple layers of complexity to that in a developing economy. And so I think development banks or any other lending institution that help accelerate and clarify the trajectory of energy development. And I think clean baseload is obviously the most critical and the starting block from which these discussions should be had. But I think it's absolutely necessary. And we shouldn't use the privileged position that the developed world, all of which have had access to nuclear and other forms of baseload power, but nuclear specifically, since we're talking about carbon reduction. We shouldn't use the privilege that we've had access to that over the last 60 or 70 years and are choosing our own path on how to accelerate or decelerate that development to influence the desires of emerging economies who maybe more than the developed world realize the importance of baseload for their economies, and then also do want it to be carbon free, leading them to be the biggest nuclear proponents that we have. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise to the world, even though a lot of people don't talk about it. It is funny who has picked up the baton, if we look globally, to being the carriers of nuclear technology forward. It's not the legacy players. And we should recognize that and we should support it. For equality.
Yeah, all very, very interesting. Adam Rodman, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
And that concludes this interview. To listen to more of these interviews and to find out more information about the World Nuclear Association Strategic eForum, please visit the website where you can find out more information about the panelists and register for the event for free. But for now, thank you for joining us and goodbye.